In the shadowed hollows of the Appalachians, where the mist clung to the pines like a shroud and the wind whispered secrets through the crags, Elias Crow ruled his kin with a fist forged in the fires of old grudges. His wife, Myra, had come to him young, bartered like livestock from a neighboring clan, her eyes once bright with the fire of mountain streams now dulled by years of unspoken torments. The cabin they shared squatted low against the ridge, its timbers warped by endless rains, the hearth flickering with a light that never warmed. Elias's brothers, Harlan and Jed, lurked nearby in their own ramshackle dens, bound by blood and the sour mash they distilled in hidden stills under the moon's indifferent gaze. One autumn eve, as the leaves bled red across the slopes, Elias gathered them by the fire, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "She's mine to give," he growled, his gaze fixed on the flames that danced like trapped souls. Myra stirred in the corner, her hands trembling on the mending, unaware that the barter had begun not for coin or cattle, but for the remnants of her shattered spirit. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and impending doom, as the brothers' eyes gleamed with a hunger that twisted the night into something far more sinister. The first frost had already bitten the ridges when Elias Crow decided the time had come. He'd been nursing the idea for weeks, letting it fester like a splinter under the nail, working it deeper every time Myra's quiet defiance showed in the set of her shoulders or the way she turned her face from his touch. That evening the cabin felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in with the way they did before a hard snow, and the fire spat and hissed as if it knew what was coming. Harlan and Jed arrived just after dusk, boots caked with red clay, carrying 2 stone jugs of the clear lightning they ran in the laurel slicks above the creek. They smelled of wood smoke, sour mash, and the wild, metallic tang of the mountains themselves. Elias waited until the first jug was half gone and the room glowed with the dull heat of too many bodies and too much whiskey. The dogs outside had gone quiet, even they sensed the shift in the air. He leaned forward then, elbows on his knees, the firelight carving deep hollows beneath his eyes. His voice came out low, almost gentle, the way a man speaks when he's already decided and only needs the others to catch up. "I'm tired of feeding her," he said. "Tired of her mouth, tired of her looking at me like I stole something that was never hers to keep." Harlan gave a wet chuckle, but Jed just stared, thumb rubbing the scar that ran from his ear to the corner of his mouth. Elias let the silence stretch until it hurt. Then he laid it out plain, Myra for a full share of the next 3 runs, plus the lower 40 acres that bordered the creek, the best ground for corn and the safest route down the mountain. No papers, no preacher, just the old way. Blood for blood, flesh for land. Harlan's eyes glittered, he licked his lips like a hound scenting meat. Jed shifted, uneasy, but the liquor and the hunger in his brother's voice pulled him along. Elias lifted his tin cup in a mock toast. "She's wore out with me," he said, smiling without warmth. "Reckon one of you might find use for what's left." The flames snapped loud in the grate, and somewhere in the loft above, a board creaked soft as a held breath. Myra had been mending a tear in Elias's only good shirt, needle moving slow and deliberate through the homespun, when the words drifted up the ladder from the room below. At first she thought the liquor had loosened their tongues into nonsense, the way it sometimes did, tall tales about bears and ghosts. Then Elias said her name, flat, hard, like a stone skipping across ice, and the needle slipped, pricking deep into her thumb. A bead of blood welled up, bright against the grey cloth, and she pressed it to her lips without thinking. She eased the shirt aside and crept to the edge of the loft on hands and knees, the boards cold against her palms. Through the gaps she could see them, Elias hunched forward, firelight licking the scar that ran along his jaw, Harlan grinning like a possum in a henhouse, Jed staring into his cup as though the answers might float there. Every word came clear, carried on the smoke. "Mine to give. Wore out. Use for what's left." The needle fell from her fingers and rolled, clinking softly against a loose nail. All 3 heads turned toward the loft at once. Myra froze, heart battering against her ribs like a trapped moth. Elias rose slow, deliberate, the way he did when he meant to make a thing feel every second of its fear. His boots struck each rung of the ladder with the patience of a man who knows no one is running far. When he reached the top, the lantern light caught the wet shine in his eyes. Myra backed until the wall met her spine. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her the way a butcher studies a cut of meat, deciding where the knife will go. Then his hand shot out, fingers knotting in her hair, yanking her head back so hard her scalp burned. "You listening, girl?" His breath was sour with corn liquor and hate. "You think you got the right to eavesdrop on men's business?" She tried to twist away, but his grip only tightened, dragging her down the ladder step by step while Harlan and Jed watched from below, silent, hungry. When her feet touched the puncheon floor he flung her forward. She caught herself against the table, palms stinging. She straightened, tasting blood where she'd bitten her tongue, and met his eyes for the first time in months. "I ain't livestock, Elias Crow," she said, voice low but steady. "You don't sell what ain't yours." He laughed then, a sound like gravel poured down a well, and backhanded her hard enough to split her lip against her teeth. The room tilted. Copper flooded her mouth. Harlan took a half step forward, eager, but Elias raised a hand and his brother stopped like a trained dog. "Oh, you're mine, darling," Elias said, wiping his knuckles on his shirt. "Bought and paid for the day your daddy traded you for 3 hogs and a rifle. Question is how much longer I keep you Braathin under my roof." He leaned in close, the heat of him suffocating. "You fight me on this, I'll bury you up on the ridge where the bears'll scatter what's left before the ground freezes. You hear me clear?" Myra stood there, blood dripping from her chin onto the packed dirt floor, the taste of iron sharp on her tongue, and felt something inside her shift, cold and quiet as creek ice breaking loose in spring, moonless and bitter, the night she ran. The first hard snow had started just after midnight, dry crystals hissing against the tin roof like 1,000 tiny claws. Myra waited until Elias's snores turned thick and wet, until the jug on the floor beside the bed gurgled empty when he rolled over. She had already hidden her boots under the cornhusk mattress and wrapped her feet in rags so the floorboards would not betray her. One dress, one shawl, the bone-handled skinning knife tucked in her sleeve, nothing else. The rest belonged to the house, and the house belonged to him. She eased the bar from the door, breath fogging in the lantern's dying glow, and slipped outside. The cold struck her like a slap, stealing the air from her lungs had hoarded. Snow already dusted the yard, erasing footprints almost as soon as they were made. She kept to the shadows of the smokehouse, then the woodpile, then the crooked fence that marked the edge of Elias's claim. Beyond that lay the laurel hells, tangled, black, endless. If she could reach the old trace that cut toward Black Hollow, maybe lose herself before dawn. She had not gone 50 yards when the dogs started. First one horse bark, then the whole pack, chained behind the barn but mad with the scent of her fear. Lantern light flared in the cabin window. A shout, Elias's voice, raw and furious, cut through the wind. She ran. Branches whipped her face, roots snatched at her ankles. Snow filled her tracks almost as fast as she made them, but the dogs knew her smell and the men knew the mountain better. She heard Harlan's wild laugh echoing off the ridge to ridge, Jed's low whistle calling the hounds. Boots pounded behind her, closer than the wind. She ducked under a fallen hemlock, crawled through briars that tore her shawl to ribbons, and came out on the far side gasping. Hands seized her from behind, rough, calloused, smelling of sour mash and gun oil. Elias spun her around, slammed her back against a poplar so hard the breath left her in a white plume. Snowflakes caught in his beard like maggots in rotted meat. Harlan and Jed circled, lanterns swinging, faces flushed with drink and the thrill of the hunt. "Look what tried to fly the coop," Elias said, voice soft, almost tender. He pressed the cold barrel of his shotgun under her chin, tilting her face to the lantern light. Blood from a briar scratch traced down her cheek like a red tear. "Thought you could outrun blood, did you?" Harlan reached for her arm, greedy fingers closing around her wrist. Jed just watched, eyes unreadable, snow piling on the brim of his hat. Elias leaned in until she felt the heat of his rage against her frozen skin. "You run again," he whispered, "and I'll hobble you like a lame mare. Chain you to the porch post so the crows can have what the cold don't take." Then louder, to his brothers, "Bring her home. She's still worth the price tonight." They dragged her back through the whitening woods, her bare feet carving crimson prints in the snow, the mountain swallowing her screams before they ever reaching another living soul. The bargain was sealed 3 nights later in the smokehouse, the only place big enough for all 3 brothers and thick enough in its walls to keep the world outside. They had dragged a scarred oak table into the center, its top still sticky with hog blood from the fall killing. A single tallow candle guttered in a cracked saucer, throwing shadows that crawled up the rafters like black spiders. The air stank of cured meat, sour mash, and the sourer sweat of men who had not washed since the chase. Elias stood at the head of the table, sleeves rolled high, forearms corded and scarred. Harlan paced, restless, eyes shining like a coon's in lantern light. Jed sat on an upturned bucket, whittling a cedar stick into nothing, the curls falling between his boots like pale wood shavings of his conscience. Elias laid it out again, slower this time, tasting every word. 3 runs, spring, summer, fall. Full share of the corn liquor money. Plus the lower 40, deed or no deed, marked by the blazes and blood. That's the price. He drew his skinning knife and sliced his left palm clean, blood welling black in the candlelight. He pressed the print to the tabletop, leaving a perfect red hand. My mark on her passes to you. Harlan whooped once, low and eager, and cut his own palm without being asked, slapped his hand down beside Elias's so the prints overlapped like a dark flower. Jed hesitated longest, knife trembling in his grip. Elias stared until the cedar stick snapped in Jed's fist. Then Jed cut, shallow but enough, and added his blood to the mess. 3 prints, 3 brothers, 1 woman. Elias reached under the table and produced a mason jar filled with last year's apple brandy, thick and dark as creek water after rain. He drank first, long and deep, then passed it left. When it came back to him, the jar was empty. He smashed it against the stone hearth. Shards glittered like ice across the floor. From the corner where she knelt, wrists raw from rope, Myra watched the candle flame shrink and flare each time a brother breathed. When Elias turned to her, his face was calm now, almost peaceful, the way a man looks when the hardest work is finally done. Stand up, he said. She rose slowly, legs numb, blood crusted at the corner of her mouth. Elias took her chin between thumb and forefinger, tilting her face to his brother's as though showing off a prize sow. Yours now, he told them. Do what you want, break what you want. Just keep her braathin long enough to work. Harlan licked his lips. Jed looked away. Elias leaned close to Myra's ear, voice soft as a lover's. Remember this night, girl. Every bruise from here on carries my name. Then he pushed her forward into Harlan's waiting arms, turned his back, and walked out into the cold without another word, leaving only the wet red prints cooling on the table and the candle burning lower, lower, until the smokehouse sank into its own black blood-smelling dark. Harlan's cabin squatted farther up the ridge, half dug into the hillside like a badger set, its chimney coughing pine smoke into the iron-grey sky. The first night he dragged her across the threshold by the hair, boots kicking the door shut so hard the leather hinges screamed. Inside, the air was thick with the reek of wet dog, old grease, and the sour ghost of every woman who had ever tried to clean the place and failed. He threw her down beside the hearth where the fire burned low and sullen, the logs hissing like snakes. Myra landed on her knees, palms scraping the grit of the puncheon floor. Harlan stood over her, breathing through his mouth, eyes bright with the same fever he got when the still ran hot and the revenue men were rumored close. He unbuckled his belt slowly, metal tongue clinking, letting the weight of it settle in her ears. Elias said you was wore out, he rasped, voice thick. Reckon I'll find out how much where you got left. She didn't beg. She had used up every plea on the mountain years ago. Instead she stared into the fire until the flames painted her eyes red, and when his hands came for her she bit clean through the fleshy web of his thumb. Harlan howled, backhanded her so hard her ears rang like chapel bells. Blood filled her mouth again, familiar as communion wine. Across the hollow, Elias sat on his own porch in the dark, rocking slow, a fresh jug cradled in his lap. He could hear Harlan's curses carried on the wind, the dull thud of fists on flesh, the sharper crack when something, maybe the iron poker, met bone. Each sound drifted down to him like music. He tipped the jug, swallowed fire, and smiled at the stars with teeth too white for the rest of his face. Inside Harlan's cabin the night stretched long. When the fire burned to coals he chained her ankle to the foot of the bedstead with the same links he used for his best hound. The metal was cold and already flecked with someone else's rust. He slept heavy, snoring, one arm flung across her like ownership. Myra lay staring at the soot-blackened rafters, counting heartbeats, tasting blood and smoke and the slow, steady birth of something that had no name yet but felt ancient as the mountain itself. Somewhere past midnight the wind shifted, carrying Elias's low, satisfied laugh across the ridge, as if even asleep he could still watch. Word travels slow in the mountains, but it travels sure, carried on creek water, on the breath of peddlers, on the wings of turkey buzzards circling something dead. By the time the first hard freeze locked the ground, every hollow from Wolf Pen to Piney Knob knew that Elias Crow had sold his wife to his own brothers like a side of venison. Folks spoke it low, behind hands, in the way they spoke of witches or stillborn babies. Some spat and crossed themselves, others just shook their heads and poured another cup of rye, because cruelty was common coin up here, only the price had never been bloodkin before. Preacher Amos Taggart heard it on a Sunday when no one came to meeting. He had stood in the doorway of his little log chapel, wind knifing through the cracks, watching snow devils whirl across the empty benches. Old Sister McCoy finally hobbled up the trace, leaning on her crabapple cane, and told him straight, "They done traded Myra Crow like a milk cow, preacher. Harlan's got her chained now. Ain't Christian." Amos was past 70, spine bent like a hickory bow from years of carrying the word up and down ridges too steep for horses. His eyes, though, were still winter clear, pale as creek ice, and they had seen things in Korea and in the coal camps that would not let him sleep easy. That night he sat by his own small fire with the Bible open on his knees, but the pages kept blurring. He saw instead the girl Myra had been barefoot at Brush Arbor Revival, singing Amazing Grace in a voice sweet enough to make grown men weep. He saw the bruises blooming on her arms the day she married Elias, saw the light go out of her eyes one fist at a time. He closed the book, laid it gentle on the mantel, and took down the old squirrel rifle instead. The barrel was pitted, the stock scarred, but it had fed him for 50 years and killed 3 men he knew of, 2 in war, 1 closer to home. He oiled the lock, poured powder, and patched a ball while the wind howled like judgment around the eaves. Before dawn he wrapped himself in a threadbare black coat, stuck a tattered copy of the Psalms in his pocket beside a handful of .32 cartridges, and started up the ridge toward Harlan's place. Snow squeaked under his boots, his breath smoked white. He did not whistle or pray aloud. He only walked, slow and deliberate, the way a man walks when he knows the devil's work is waiting and has decided the Lord helps those who load their own gun. Behind him, the chapel door swung to and fro in the wind, banging like a heartbeat no one was left to hear. Days grew shorter and meaner after Harlan took to leaving her unchained while he tended the still, figuring the mountain and her bruised ribs would keep her put. Myra moved slow through the chores, hauling water from the spring, feeding the hounds, scrubbing pots black with soot, every motion measured to keep the pain from flaring white-hot. One afternoon the sky hung low and sullen, spitting sleet that stung like buckshot. Harlan had trudged off with Jed to check the mash barrels, boots crunching up the trace, voices fading into the hiss of frozen rain. She stood alone in the yard, breath fogging, staring at the leaning shed tacked onto the back of the cabin like an afterthought. The door hung crooked on leather hinges, half open, revealing a slice of darkness that smelled of coal oil and rot. Something pulled her toward it, the same tug she used to feel as a child when thunder rolled close and the grown folks whispered of buried things. She glanced once toward the ridge, saw no smoke from Elias's chimney, no sign of return, and slipped inside. The shed was colder than outside, air thick with the sweet sick stink of old apples gone to vinegar. Shelves sagged under jars of nails, rusted traps, bundles of yellowed papers tied with twine. She lit the stub of candle Harlan kept by the door, its flame trembling as she moved deeper. Beneath a pile of burlap sacks she found a tin deed box, lid dented, lock long since pried. Inside lay photographs curled at the edges, stern faces in Sunday clothes, and a ledger bound in cracked leather. Pages crackled when she opened it, ink faded but legible. Names. Dates. Sums of money. Women's names she had never heard spoken aloud. Cora Lee, 1903, traded for 40 acres. Delphia, 1917, 2 jugs and a mule. Ruth Ann, 1931, gone missing after the flood. Beside each, a crude sketch of a handprint in red-brown that flaked when she touched it. At the bottom, fresh ink still dark, Myra, autumn 1948, 3 runs plus lower 40. Her stomach turned cold. Tucked beneath the ledger was a smaller book, no title, pages brittle as dead leaves. In it, Cramped handwriting told of a great-grandmother brought down from the Melungeons, said to carry the old site in her blood. Cures and curses, signs to read in fire and water, ways to turn a man's hate back on itself. Myra's fingers traced the words, feeling the paper warm beneath her touch as if it recognized kin. She heard the crunch of boots outside too late. The candle guttered wild in a draught. Harlan's shadow filled the doorway, sleet melting in his beard, eyes narrowing at the open box, and the secrets spilled across her lap like entrails. The poison came from the shed itself, 3 fat deathcap mushrooms she had dried on a string behind the stovepipe where Harlan never looked. They looked innocent enough, pale and papery, like something a child might mistake for store-bought. She powdered them fine between 2 stones while the men were still out in the laurel thicket, working the still through the night so the revenue men wouldn't catch the smoke by day. The powder went into the big iron pot with the beans, stirred slow so it vanished into the salt pork grease and molasses, the way sorrow vanishes into a woman's face after enough years. Harlan came in first, stomping snow off his boots, face raw from wind. Jed followed, quieter, carrying the empty jugs. They ate straight from the pot with wooden spoons, grunting approval at the rich, earthy taste, asking for seconds before the bowls were half gone. Myra sat on the hearthstool, hands folded in her lap, watching the candlelight play across their throats working, Adam's apples bobbing like fishing corks. She felt nothing yet, only the cold knot low in her belly that had lived there so long it felt like home. It started with Harlan. He leaned back from the table, belched, then frowned like he'd tasted something suddenly wrong. Sweat broke across his forehead though the fire was low. Jed set his spoon down slow, eyes going glassy. Within an hour both men were on their knees, retching yellow bile onto the puncheon floor, guts cramping so hard their spines bowed like longbows. Harlan clawed at his throat, veins standing purple, accusing her between heaves. "Witch, you done poisoned us." Jed tried to stand, staggered, crashed into the table and sent bowls spinning. Myra rose then, steady as creek ice, and fetched the water bucket. She poured a dipperful over Harlan's head when he lunged for her, blinding him long enough for her to step aside. He fell hard, cheek smacking the floor, legs drumming. Jed curled on his side, whimpering like a hound with a gut full of glass. The cabin stank of vomit and terror and the sour-sweet reek of death working fast. She stood over them, candle in one hand, the bone-handled knife now naked in the other. Their eyes found hers, wild, pleading, furious, and in them she saw every fist, every chain, every night they had laughed while she bled. The storm outside rose to a howl, rattling the shutters like bones in a box. Harlan tried once more to crawl toward her, fingers hooked into claws, but his strength ran out with the last of the beans and he lay twitching, spit foaming pink at the corners of his mouth. Myra crouched, brought the candle close enough that the heat singed Harlan's beard, and spoke for the first time all evening, voice soft as falling ash. "You bought me cheap," she said. "Now pay the interest." The storm came down off the ridge like the mountain itself had decided to finish what men started. Wind screamed through the gaps, driving sleet sideways so hard it rattled the tin roof like buckshot. Harlan and Jed lay retching and burning with fever, too weak now to do more than moan, but the poison worked slow enough that they still breathed, still knew. Myra stood over them with the knife and the candle and eyes older than her years. Word of the sickness reached Elias by dusk. A boy from the lower hollow pounded on his door, half frozen, babbling that his brothers were dying and the woman had gone mad with witchwork. Elias stood on the porch a long minute, listening to the wind, then took down his shotgun, loaded both barrels with cut shell, and started up the trace alone. The storm swallowed his lantern almost at once. He walked by memory and rage, coat plastered to his back, beard iced solid. He kicked Harlan's door clean off its hinges. Inside, the cabin glowed hellish, fire low, tallow candles guttering, the air thick with vomit and smoke and something darker. Harlan lay on his side by the hearth, lips blue, clawing feebly at the floorboards. Jed had dragged himself halfway to the door, leaving a wet red streak behind him like a foot wide. Myra stood in the center of it all, apron soaked crimson, hair wild, the knife hanging loose in her hand as though it had grown there. Elias raised the shotgun. "Step away from my property." Myra laughed once, low, the sound a wolf might make finding the trap already sprung. "Property don't bleed this pretty, Elias." Lightning cracked outside, bleaching the room white for one heartbeat. In that flash he saw the overturned table, the scattered bowls, the death caps shriveled black on the mantel like tiny hanged men. Thunder followed so close it shook snow from the rafters. He swung the shotgun toward her, but the floor was slick with sickness and melted sleet. His boot slid, barrel jerking skyward. She moved faster than the storm, knife flashing up under his guard. The blade took him high in the shoulder, grated bone, stuck fast. He roared, backhanded her with the stock, sent her sprawling into the hearthstones. Sparks exploded, her sleeve caught fire. They came together again in the red half-dark, brothers forgotten, only the two of them left, Elias bleeding rivers down his coat, Myra burning like a brand, the storm outside and the storm inside feeding one another until the whole ridge seemed ready to tear loose and slide into the void. The cabin became a butcher's pen lit by lightning. Elias had the shotgun wrenched away and broken over his knee like kindling, but his hands were still weapons. Myra's sleeve burned, the stink of scorched wool and skin rising between them, yet she did not scream. She came off the hearthstones with the poker, its tip white-hot, and drove it through the meat of his thigh. He bellowed, staggered, and the storm answered with a blast that tore half the shingles from the roof. Snow and sleet poured in, hissing where it struck the coals. Harlan tried once more to crawl, fingers hooked like claws, but his eyes rolled white and he slumped, tongue thick and black between his teeth. Jed lay still, staring at the rafters as though he could already see whatever waited beyond. Elias lunged again, caught Myra by the throat, lifted her clean off the floor and slammed her against the log wall. Breath exploded from her lungs, black spots danced. His face was inches from hers, blood, and in the stuttering lightning she saw something break open behind his eyes, something that had always been there but never named. "You ain't Crow," he rasped, blood bubbling at his lip. "Never was." She felt his grip loosen, just a fraction, as the words sank in. Then she drove her knee up, twisted, and the poker came free of his leg with a wet sucking sound. She brought it down across his collarbone, bone cracked like green hickory in a fire. He dropped to his knees, gasping. Myra stepped back, chest heaving, and spoke into the howling dark. "My mammy's mammy came off the Melungeon Road. They paid coin for her, same as you paid hogs for me. But blood remembers what bargains forget." She reached into her apron pocket, drew out the little leather-bound book from the shed, and tore a page free. On it was drawn a hand, crude but unmistakable, the same handprint that marked the ledger, only this one was done in charcoal and menstrual blood years before she was born. She held it to the dying fire until it caught, then dropped the burning scrap onto Elias's chest. Flame raced up his shirt, fed by coal oil and sour mash soaked into the wool. He shrieked, beating at himself, but the storm wind fanned it higher. Myra watched him burn, watched the skin blacken and split, watched the proudest man on the ridge crawl on his belly toward a door that no longer hung. Behind her the roof groaned, beams sagging under the weight of snow and ruin. She stepped over Jed's body, over Harlan's, and walked out into the white dark with the fire roaring at her back and the mountain finally quiet except for the wind singing her true name through the burning pines.